welcome, thank you. I think the title of this is Commodities Nationalization. And I'll be honest, Dave and I have been kind of wondering what it meant and what it was all about. So I think what we'll do is start off with some initial comments about what we think the topic is, and then we'll go from there and then open it up for questions. And probably knowing what I'll say, will probably stimulate some questions. But let me give the mic to David, if you'll start.
All right, well, welcome everyone, and thanks, Jeff. So commodity nationalization. So yeah, we actually swapped emails. Like, what's this about? And I don't know. I hope you do. Okay, so you can take it a couple ways. The way I look at it initially is what I said earlier in my speech, and that was, as the resource sector in total, not just talking precious metals, continues to decline, especially you can make case for the ags. You know, excuse my slang, I traded commodities for years, but the agricultural commodities, foodstuffs, start to decline more and more for various reasons. Then people do at the micro scale what we do at the macro scale, or vice versa, which means you have a tendency to hold on to what you have. So the global trade that we've all enjoyed for so long is not ending, but it is supply chain disruptions, is a fancy way to say it. So I think that's part of the nationalization, which means that, hey, my nation state first, not, my export balance. And I think that's a trend that's established, and I think it's going to continue. So I think that's one of the ways to look at nationalization, and that's primarily how I do it. We go into other areas. I mean, the main, as much as, I'm a gold and silver nut, on, and then, that's a preserver of wealth. But, unless we get to eat, it doesn't matter, right? And I've said many times, and this is extreme, but I think in extremes, and that is, you could have a big pile of gold and want to buy, a New York steak, but if that beef doesn't exist in your town, it doesn't matter how much money you've got, you're not going to be able to obtain it. Again, an extreme example, but I try to make the point. And when the flow of goods do not go, in my studied view, in a free market or a least deterred market, then usually bullets do. And I don't like to say that, that's a quote or close to it, and yet that's kind of what we're witnessing now. So Jeff may have another view. I'll pass the mic. I can hog the mic, so.
Okay, yeah, looking at the topic, I came up with, I guess, 4 areas that I would want to talk about over the next however much time we have. The first one is, past confiscations and the future prospects for confiscations. And this is really focusing on gold and silver. And I spend a lot of time with people who say, well, the US government confiscated gold in 1933, and what's the prospect that it's going to happen again? And let's be honest, there are a lot of fear mongers who sell precious metals predicated on the idea that the government's going to call in your money, and they're going to call in your gold, and they're going to call in everything else, and you have to take what you have. You have to be careful. And, I'm a big proponent of having the gold, or at least some of your gold, in your own possession, having other gold stored in non-bank depositories that are reputable and trustworthy, and some of those depositories may not be in your home country. So that's one of the areas that I'd like to talk about, and I'll start with an anecdote. I had a client who was a multi-billionaire, and he came to me and he said in 2004, I have gold and silver in a US bank account in London. And I've been told that one of the cottage industries that CPM Group does, one of the services you provide investors, is you help investors move gold and silver to non-bank depositories. And I said, yes, that's what we do. And so we helped him move gold and silver out of a bank depository in London to a non-bank depository in a different country. And this was at a time when international banking regulations were changing and governments were saying, from now on, our banks will swap information. And it was also 2004. There's a lot of nasty things going on terms of the US government, in terms of international politics. He also then had us buying precious metals for him. But early in the relationship, he said, I want to have dinner with you and talk to you about me. Because I'm not a crazy guy. I know a lot of people think that only crazy people buy gold. I'm not a crazy guy. Here's my life story. I was born in 1941 in the Soviet Union during World War II. My father was a soldier. After the war, he was stationed in East Berlin. His job was to shoot people in the back as they ran across the no man's land, about 100 yards of gravel, into West Germany. He came home one night when I was 7 years old. He said, take what you can in your backpack. Your mother, you, and I are running across the zone tonight. I've paid my comrades some gold coins, and they've promised me not to shoot us in the back. But they promise everybody they won't shoot them in the back when they get their gold coins. But because I'm a soldier, maybe they'll let us go. They ran. They made it to West Germany. They made it to the United States. He went to school here. He made his billions not by building a company. He built an industry. No one else was doing what he did. He invented something. It's a big industry in the country. He said, now, I'm doing this because my life story tells me that a government can promise you all sorts of things like freedom on a piece of paper, and it's all meaningless. Dave was talking very eloquently about real estate and gold and silver are the ultimate investments, and they are. And the problem with real estate is you can't put it in your backpack and run away with it. So real estate's a very good investment, but gold and silver are even better because you can have it elsewhere too. And I guess the world going forward, our biggest fear is that all governments everywhere all at the same time say, oh, we're taking everything you've got. And that's probably the biggest risk I have. You know, and I've been quoting Amanda Gorman, who had an editorial in the New York Times about 3 months ago, and she said, if you're not afraid, you're not paying attention. So that's that. Now, before I give the mic back to David, I'll just say a little bit more on gold and silver confiscations. In 1929, the Great Depression started, not just in the United States, but globally. Our estimate is that about 33% of the wealth in the world, private wealth, was denominated in gold at that time. It could have been a lot more. Numbers just don't exist historically. People looked at the Depression, they looked at the deflation that was accompanying it, and they bought gold. They sucked money out of the banking system and bought gold, and they were holding it at home. In 1933, Roosevelt became president and started to try to recover. After his inauguration, he marched down to the White House. He wanted to have a parade. The inaugural organization committee said, no, it's too dangerous. He said, no, we have to have a parade. They lined Pennsylvania Avenue with soldiers in nests with machine guns trained on the Americans who had come out to watch the inaugural parade. He came back to the White House and he closed the banks, declared a bank holiday for about a week. And everyone knew that he was going to ask for all the gold coins to be turned in. But he didn't do that for a month. During that month, Americans turned in 40 million of the estimated 54 million ounces of gold coins they owned. He ultimately declared, hey, turn in your gold coins, April 4th, 1933. Another 4 million ounces trickled in, and about 12 million ounces were never turned in. And there were certain provisions. You could have up to 2 coins of each year's mintage, and you could keep those as collectibles. So that was it. People turned in their coins. There was never a Treasury cop or an FBI agent or anybody else who went into somebody's home or office or bank vault or deposit box and took gold. Contrast that to the Prohibition, where my grandmother was thrown in jail for being a bootlegger. And they poured the stuff down the drains, which is just like that, Italian Catholic. That's a cardinal sin, throwing liquor down the drain. But the reality was that before he even issued the edict in April, he closed the banks. When he reopened the banks 5 days later, there were enormous lines in front of banks across the country of people redepositing their money. 5 days earlier, the Army felt they needed to protect the new president with machine guns. 5 days later, they're saying this guy can actually save us. But the important thing for all of us in this room is that gold represented about 33% of private wealth back then, and it was very detrimental to economic growth to have a third of the wealth sucked out of the banking system. You couldn't loan money to people who needed to borrow money because you didn't have any money because it was in gold at somebody's house. Today, the amount of gold, the amount of private sector wealth held in gold is up to 0.8%. If you're a monetary authority and you're in a depression and you say, how can we get money into the system? Confiscating gold is not going to help you. Confiscating silver, which is like 0.001%, is not going to help you, especially because, given monetary systems as they exist today, all you have to do is say, oh, let there be money. So if you need to reflate, you don't need to confiscate gold and silver. So I think of people who say, I'm worried about the government taking my gold and silver. I think of them as, I grew up in St. Louis, the edge of the Ozarks. I think of them as people, on the front porch of their house in the holler, and they're sitting there on their rocking chairs with shotguns waiting for the feds, the revenuers to come down the road. And meanwhile, the feds come in the back door through monetary expansion and inflation and cleaned out your house. So I look at confiscation. I don't see it as a future problem. I do see the diminution of purchasing power as a real problem, and that's where gold and silver comes in. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about was all the other commodities, which David rightly points out are probably much more important and problematic going forward. But let me kick it over to Mike.
I just really can't add much. I mean, I'm in the same camp as Jeff. I really think this confiscation thing is way overblown. I mean, I've thought about it, and my friend Bob Coleman, who some of you know, makes a case, and I agree. If they are, whoever they are, the government is going to take it. They're not going to come knock on our door, go our safe deposit box. Everything that Jeff said, I agree. They might, and this is a very remote possibility, go to like an ETF or something. There it is, this big pile, we can grab it. But to make it do anything, as Jeff said, and I'll just reiterate it, you'd have to put the paper price on silver. It'd have to be so astronomical as to have any meaningful effect in the monetary sphere today. It wouldn't make any sense. And gold you could, and I think there's still a possibility of a reset where gold is part of the equation, but I'm not certain of that either. So, and I'll give it back to Jeff. I think I'll set him up. I think, I talked about ags. If you really want to get down to brass tacks, you really want to get down to the absolute, it's energy. It's energy. And, I am a peak oil guy. I admit it. Am I right or wrong? I don't know. I keep studying it. I'm not like 100%. I'm absolutely right. I hardly ever take that kind of position. But to the best of my ability, if we had 80 Baddick oil, how come all these wells in Texas dry up and they don't repercolate with oil if it's coming from everywhere, right? So that's what concerns me. And I think there is a direct correlation between the price of oil and the price of the metals. And I do see higher energy prices in the future, and that implies strongly we'll see higher precious metals prices. Back to you.
I want to open it up to questions, but first let's talk a little bit about other commodities. Elliot, Did you ever return that DVD? No, I didn't. Okay. We have a DVD at CPM Group. It's 3 Days of the Condor, a movie that came out probably 1975. And we have it at CPM Group because it's a rule that when you join CPM Group, if you haven't watched it, you get the DVD. Elliot's only worked for us, what, a decade? It's worth it. It's worth seeing. It's a very good fiction, but it's a fiction based on fact, and it's based on oil and oil shortages and the government doing bad things because it needs to supply oil to people to keep the population docile. Well, supplied with oil. Oil's a real issue. Agricultural real issue. If you look at the capped wells in the United States has more oil reserves in capped wells, privately owned companies that were pumping oil from wells, and they said, you know what, just turn it off. We have more oil in our capped wells than the official Saudi reserves. Now, Saudi Arabia, everyone in the oil industry knows, has enormous multiples of what their official reserves are. So Saudi official reserves are the largest in the world, but they're a fraction of what's really there. But the U.S. has an enormous amount of oil in privately owned capped wells and natural gas. We have a chart that we use in some of our presentations, which shows consumer beef prices, which have been rising steadily for 40 years, more sharply in the last 18 months, and wholesale meat prices, cattle on the hoof, which have been falling steadily for 40 years. The meatpacking industry has gone from something like 32 meat packers in 1980 to 4. The meat packers say to the ranchers, screw you, I'll pay you this for your cattle. Then they turn to the consumers and say, screw you, I'll charge you this for your beef. And that is probably the biggest risk for commodities nationalization. I gave you oil, I gave you beef, but you can look at vegetables, you can look at all sorts of other things. And you can have a situation where these oligarchically controlled commodities, the government simply says, people need food, people need energy, people need oil and gas. We have to come in and do something. In the 1930s, the 1940s, there was a greater amount of political will and political conception of commonwealth. So when the government said, hey, turn in your gold, 40 million out of 54 million, 56 million ounces were turned in voluntarily before the decree was even issued. When you had tin that you needed for the war effort, when you needed victory gardens, that was there. In the 50s and 60s, it was still there. That's all gone away right now. And so I think the major problem and the major risk for commodities nationalization is everything but precious metals. Things that people need. You know, someone said, why has gold been used as money, especially way back when? And the answer is because gold's useless. You know, I'm a Stone Age person. I can get copper, I can get steel, I can make bronze. I'm living in the Bronze Age, I'm living in the Iron Age. And then I'm getting this gold stuff. And it's like, well, it's too soft to use. So what am I going to use it for? I'm going to use it for money. You know, sort of what it is. So there's gold and silver, and then there's all the other commodities that we use. And that's, I think, the real risk.
It sparked a thought, and I haven't seen your moment. I can't remember what it was. I think on balance, you know, we have to look at the bigger picture, and that's kind of what we're discussing here. You know, money, metals, it's an important part, but it's not the most important part. Oh, I know what I sparked. Looking at the cycle that I talked about briefly from the podium, that we go from like the pioneer to the frontiersman and on through this cycle, I think you could make a case, the fourth turning does, where certain generations have a certain attitude. And Jeff used Commonwealth. And that would be true of, I'd say, the World War II generation. And you get to the boomers, and I hate to say this, but I am one. I don't mind saying I'm a boomer. Can't change a fact. But early in my booming days when I got out of college and got my first job and all that, there used to be these bumper stickers that he who dies with the most toys wins. So that shows you a change of perception or attitude about what your meaning is from the World War II generation. Yes, victory gardens, yes, we're going to pull together. Yes, we're going to make this happen, to you get almost too wealthy. The cycle of the Age of Empire, the way I understand it, it's in that movie that I've talked about all the time, the Four Horsemen film. You go from too little to too much, to too little to too much. I mean, that's the essence of it, as direct as I can say it. And we're in that place now where we've had too much for too long. And now we're starting to see that it's not always there, always, and everywhere. And what are we going to do about it? Are we going to be civilized human beings and work this thing out? Are we going to have to trade at the edict of, someone with, government? To me, I'm a Harry Brown advocate, as you all know, most of you know. Harry said one thing. I hated it when he heard it the first time. Government is force. He's not talking about communism or fascism. He's talking about government, period. Doesn't matter what face you put on it, government is force. Harry, come on. But when you think about it, or at least the way I think about it is, a lot of times they end up saying you are getting X amount of oil, cooking oil, X amount of sugar, X amount of loaves of bread, and meat next week. So anyway, back to you.
Let's open it up for questions or comments. There are all kinds of demographic shifts that are already having major issues, and it's interesting because if you look at the United Nations has 50-year projections of demographics and populations in different countries and regions. And if you look at it, they've had Europe declining for 30 years, but they have the population in Europe rising basically from now, the 2020, 2030, going forward. And when you say to the demographers at the United Nations, how is that? See, it's immigration from Muslim countries and African countries. People getting out of poverty, political repression, religious oppression, and oligarchic societies, moving to the social welfare states of Europe. And I think that's one of the things to watch. And, so I think that there are a lot of demographics that are very important. Declining birth rates are very important. Governments look at these things and they say, where are we going to do it? I've actually been of the view for some time, and CPM Group has it as our long-term economic view, that we're looking at surplus labor, surplus manufacturing capacity, surplus commercial real estate, surplus retail capacity on a global basis. And right now we've gone through some cyclical problems, so we've had some shortages, but on a longer term basis, you're probably looking at surpluses. And the governments look at surplus labor and they say, we have no solution for this. When Francois Hollande became Prime Minister of France, he said, well, what we're going to do is go to a 30-hour work week, and people will retire when they're 45 or something like that. And I remember asking this French socialist economist friend of mine, what's his plan for surplus labor? He said, this is it. It's giving people freedom and time and financial support, what they call permanent income, to enjoy the arts and sports. And I said, that's the solution? And he said, do you know any country, any government that has a better idea? And the answer is no. And I think that, you have to get them drunk, but if you talk to any politician in any country and you say, what's your long-term plan for labor surpluses, they say, we have none. To be retired but be retired from government by the time it really hits. So I think that's a real big issue, and you're going to have some demographic changes. David talked about my parents' generation. They grew up in the Depression and then World War II, and that was true worldwide. And these people gave up freedoms in exchange for housing and food and jobs. And our generation, Michael Milken made the very big point. Our generation said, wait a second, why did we give up those freedoms? Okay, I could understand that in the 1940s and 1950s, But this is 1964. Come on, you know. And my view about the Austrian School of Economics is it made a lot of sense in the 40s and 50s, but I'm not sure that it makes so much sense in the current situation. It was a very good description of what was going on at that time. So we wanted our freedoms back. And one of the big fears is, given the economic and political and financial strains that we see, and the occurrences of crises, 2008, 2010 and 11, 2020, what we think is coming down the road in a couple years, you know, people will be willing to give up freedoms in exchange for security and housing and food. And some people call it socialism. In Europe, they called it feudalism. Yeah, the lord of the manor was responsible for the education and well-being and food and housing and medical attention of the people who lived on his lands. And as the feudal system gave way to capitalism in the 19th century in England, it was an ultra-conservative, Benjamin Disraeli, who said, you know what, the government has replaced the feudal state, feudal lords, and we have a moral imperative to provide food and housing and medical attention. And so all of these things that Americans think of as socialist, the Europeans thought of it as almost returning to a feudalism. You know, and the concern is that that happens on a worldwide basis. Two sons who are 34 and 38, and I'm blessed by the fact that they're really smart and they're really energetic and they really studied hard. And one of them is actually a scientist at NASA. He's not a rocket scientist, he's on the aeronautics side, although he's done work on the astronomic side. And he's tall and he's handsome, so they use him for these jobs programs where he goes off. And people say, how do I get a job like you? And he says, well, you bust your chops in school, you work really hard, you study extra stuff, you go to graduate school, you know, you work 90 hours a week, and then if you're lucky, you can get a job like mine. Yeah. Now, the same guy, before he became a rocket scientist, was working on sound and lighting on the road program, Broadway shows, that road shows. And he was in Florida the day that Lehman went bust in September of 2008. And he was helping put together the lighting and sound for the Wizard of Oz road show. And he would put a big TV on the stage while they were working. And at one point in mid-morning, he came down and he said, I'm going to buy lunch for everybody. You know, and so over lunch, they're sitting there and they're saying, why are you doing this? And he said, well, I bought S&P mini puts and the stock market plunged today and I made, you know, thousands of dollars. And they said, what are S&P mini puts? So he explained it. And he explained how you can buy a put to take advantage of declining prices. And there's something about that, if I can remember, I'll get it. And he said, and they said, well, how'd you learn this stuff? And he said, well, I got this big book and I studied it, and then I created dummy models, and I traded on paper, but not with real money, until I was confident, and then I started trading with real money, and that's how I did it. And as he was saying that, I came on the screen behind him on CNN talking about the Lehman collapse and the decline in the Dow and the rise in gold prices. And somebody pointed to it, and he said, oh, yeah, and that's my father. Yeah, so he has a lucky thing. But the thing, you said it in the morning meeting, you have to take control of your life. And you have to say, I am responsible for that. When I was at J. Aron, we were bought by Goldman Sachs, and I started reporting to the Goldman chief economist. And I went over to his office for a monthly meeting, and his secretary said, your tie is too long. And I said, no, my torso's too short. And she said, you'll never get ahead at Goldman if you're going to take responsibility for your own shortcomings. But you will get ahead in life if you take responsibility for your shortcomings, learn from them, study dispassionately what you did wrong, and correct it. And I hate to say it, but that's the road forward. You know. Now, What was I? There was,
What career path might be good for Zoomers?
yeah, no, there was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was. So,
A great question. My oldest daughter is 29. My youngest is 27. Flexibility, I think, is absolutely key. You know, that's what I've told my girls is, you know, you're going to have 5 different jobs. Look at your dad. I mean, you know, I never made it to astrophysics. I'm a mere aeronautical engineer, but believe me, there aren't many of those, and Chen knows what I'm talking about. But that's it, you know, and already my youngest has been, I don't like the term, but it's clear what it is. She's a headhunter. And I don't know much about that other than they got very specialized. And she got very specialized in the bioengineering. So she knew the language, because if you're going to offer somebody a job that's making $180,000, a $25,000 bonus and $280, you know, you got to know the language. You got to know. So she got very specialized as in that career path. And she says, I'm burning out. I want to do something else. And I didn't say I told you so, but she wants what she's going to do. Well, she's going back to school, right? She's going to get a new skill set. She wants to be in technical writing, right? The only class I ever took in engineering was called Technically Right. And then I did what my, you know, passion was, which is go back and get a degree in finance. But regardless of my career, it's that you have to be flexible, not only in your career choices, but in life in general. I mean, are we getting into this rather dark period? I think we are. But that doesn't mean we can't be the light. In other words, when you go to the store and you can't get grapes in the middle of winter like we do now because they come from South America, you don't have to have a panic attack. You know, you get the fruit that's available in your area. And that's how we used to live for a long time. It's only been, as I said, if I could repeat myself, you know, you go from too much to too little. And Jeff hit the nail on the head. You have too much labor. Really, in a way, you could say too much people, and I'm not for population control, that's me. But nonetheless, if you got an abundance of people and fewer jobs and more robotics and more efficiencies, and true capitalism would become more productive. And in a sound money system, at least in the past, you actually have a slight deflation. But there's nothing wrong, in theory, with expanding money supply as the population and production expands. That's okay. But when it gets out of kilter, like it has now, and you've got to keep running in place to keep up to nowhere, which is about the best analogy I can think of, we have some issues ahead. So I hope that helped you.
I think we're in transition, and we're at high risk of moving from a free market economy to an oligarchic economy. And, you know, it's interesting because if you read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776, sort of like the handbook for capitalism, he made it very clear that there had to be societal or governmental controls. And those controls have gone away, and they've gone out of whack. And you have this oligarchic control. I talked about the beef industry. I talked about oil and gas, housing. You are now moving to a situation where people will be renters, and the housing stock will be owned by Steve Nugent. Yeah, Steve's father was a great man at Goldman Sachs when I was there. He doesn't talk to Steve because Steve's become such a prostitute. You know, Steve's job before taking over the Treasury under Trump and going to $1.7 trillion on a sustained basis was buying houses that were being foreclosed upon, offering people these rent-to-buy deals that would not work, further impoverishing them, and becoming basically a slumlord. And that is just another industry. You're seeing the same thing with autos, and it's been going on for 40 years. You know, back in the 1980s, the auto industry used to sell cars at the beginning of the 80s. Then they said, we'll lease cars. We'll lease them for 3 years. But you know what? That's not good. So we'll lease them for 5 years. But we're going to do all this advertising to cause consumers to want a new car in 3 years. So you know what? You bring your car in, you got 2 years left on the lease. We'll roll that into the lease on the new car. And that, okay, now that lease goes on for 2 more cars, and a 5-year lease is just prohibitive, so we're going to make it a 7-year lease. Yeah. So what you've got really are oligarchic structures creating a nation of debtors. And yeah, it has to change. Can it change? We don't have the political willpower that they had. You know, people talk about the fact that U.S. federal debt as a percentage of GDP is like up around 120% now. It was 120 some odd percent in 1947. And we paid it down. We increased our debt from 1947 to 1981. But in 1981, our total federal debt was less than $1 trillion. And the federal debt as a percentage of GDP went from like 127% to, I think, like 20%. The tax cuts of the early 80s and the government deficit spending changed all that. How did they do that? 91% marginal tax rate, right? How do we get out of this one? Going from, say, 38 to 40% marginal tax rate and imposing the taxes and not letting corporations and people who make a lot of money on our backs escape paying any taxes. Actually having an effective tax rate of 40%. I have a company in New York. New York has a minimum corporate tax because it's New York. Everyone knows that if you own a corporation in New York, you're never going to be profitable for tax reasons. So the state says, okay, there's a minimum tax on a corporation because we know that you are profitable. You've got to have the willpower that they had in the 40s and 50s and 60s. We had a marginal tax rate of 90% into like, the Kennedy era. And he reduced it to 60%, and it stayed at 60% or 61%, I think, until Reagan changed it. And you had taxpayers who were willing to pay that, and you had government politicians who were willing to say to the people who voted for them, hey, let's be real. We need this money. But we're in a situation now where we don't have to do that. There's a great video, and I think we're out of time. There's a great video on YouTube of Ronald Reagan speaking at the 1964 Republican National Convention. And people put it up there because he's talking about how the Democrats are socialists and communists and gay. But the interesting thing is what he's saying is the Social Security system is going to be bankrupt. It's a socialist system, and it's going to be bankrupt within a few years. This is in 1964. And the Republican Party has been saying that for 58 years now. If we increased just the payment from the business, not the individual withholding tax, by 0.5%, and if we increase the threshold from 145,000 to 200,000, we would have a Social Security system that is financed as far as the eye can see. You don't even have to raise the retirement age. 0.5% on the corporate contributions on withholding tax. Very simple, relatively painless. Those corporations are making billions of dollars and not paying any taxes anyway. So there are a lot of things that you could do that would be relatively painless. Raising the marginal tax rate on the top 1% generates about $300 billion of additional revenue. Raising it on the next 4% actually increases revenues about 180%, 180 billion. It's like the top 1% earns more than the next 4%. So there are simple things that could be done, but the country simply doesn't have the political willpower, and the politicians find it in their worst interest to increase the marginal tax on their donors. I think we're way out of time. And Chen's on. Thank you all.